Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
It was great to engage with senior thinkers in the procurement profession, working with Business Reporter on their podcast, Supply Chain Talk, and thanks very much to them for allowing us to publish this podcast. It was really interesting to understand how important it is for procurement people to engage around the whole sustainability agenda, because believe me, we have a lot to contribute. So if you're a procurement professional or if you're a sustainability professional wanting to understand more about procurement people and how they operate, please do listen and enjoy this podcast.
So, hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Supply Chain Talk. My name is Duncan Brock. I'm a director at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, and I'm delighted to be able to host today's discussion. Every week on Supply Chain Talk, we choose a different topic, something that's of real interest to all of you. And today, we're going to be looking at how procurement can have a real impact on the quality of life for everyone, which I think is going to be a really interesting focus of the positive impact that procurement can make. In the recent time, we've had a lot of focus on the reactive nature of procurement, but looking at much more at the longer term strategic impact that we can make by doing the right thing through our procurement and driving the right behaviours going forward. My colleague Ian Scholar hosted a discussion around how digital transformation is strengthening the links in supply chain, which was a very interesting discussion with there. Good to actually sort of listen back to him and hear some of the comments that he and his guests made. I've got a couple of guests joining me today. I'll introduce them in a short period of time, but they're real experts in the field of procurement and supply chain, and also I think we've got a real passion of the impact that procurement can make in the quality of life. So that's what we're going to do. Those of you who've watched before on Supply Chain Talk, you know we also have a topical news story, and we'll bring that up in a minute. So we'll talk a bit more about macro economic aspects of supply chains before we drop down into the specifics of procurement and the impact on quality of life going forward. What I'd like to do is probably bring in our first guest. Our guest is Richard Marwood, who's the Commercial Contracts Director at Transport for Wales. Welcome to Supply Chain Talk. Maybe a very quick intro to yourself, and then we'll pick up the discussion around the news story.
Yeah, certainly. So, as you said, my name's Richard Marwood. I'm Commercial Contracts Director for Transport for Wales. For those who aren't aware, Transport for Wales is wholly owned by the Welsh Government. Our sort of primary focus is, or what we're best known for, is probably the rail operation at the moment, Wales and Borders region in the UK. But of course, we also have responsibilities across other modes as well. So we do a lot of work on bus and indeed active travel. So very much thinking about the topic we're coming on to, very much focused on that, you know, that side of sustainability and public transport and how that supports the wider good. For me, I've been here about 9 months. Prior to that, I spent about 16 years in defence. Okay. So slightly different sector that I've just moved into.
Right. And where are you based? Is it Cardiff, is it?
I know I'm based in Cardiff, yeah.
Okay, right. Yeah, and you obviously haven't quite got the Welsh accent yet perfected in the way you'd like to.
Probably have said good afternoon in Welsh because we are a dual, we're bilingual organisation, but unfortunately for me, my Welsh is spectacularly poor, I'm afraid.
Okay. But we'll get there. Maybe in a couple of years' time, we'll bring you back on, and
I'll come back, and might be more fluent.
Very good, Richard. Thank you. And let's open up with a discussion on the news story. We could, as we say every week, at the moment we could choose any news story that we'd like to around supply chain. But the one we wanted to sort of pick up today was around sort of, I suppose, the latest shock to the supply chains with Shenzhen in China locking down again and causing sort of further shocks to the supply chain. And actually, you know, this I think came out on Monday in Supply Chain Dive as an article. But I think when I looked at it, and it was one of those, there's so much in the news at the moment, but the fact that, you know, 11 districts have already locked down, COVID cases are rising again as we go forward. And we know Shenzhen's a major sort of logistics, manufacturing, shipping hub. And I think this story was talking more about the impact on freight and the blockages is that going to cause. But we've already got freight problems as we go through anyway, as we go forward. More pressures on supply chains generally. And then I think there's also comments towards the end of the article around the fact that Foxconn, who we know is a major supplier into Apple, were basically suspending production, and they weren't yet saying when they were going to restart again. So just another impact on supply chains that all of us are going to feel probably as we go forward. And I suppose, Richard, when you reflect on that and you reflect on the general fragility of supply chains now and the problems, that it just seems to be yet another shock, doesn't it? Yet another impact that we're all trying to cope with.
No, I completely agree. I mean, firstly, I have a lot of sympathy for the individuals who themselves are getting COVID. I'm currently got 3/4 of my household have just tested positive, and I suspect I'm about to make it 100% in the next day or two. So apologies if I'm coughing and spluttering throughout. But no, I completely agree. I think it illustrates really well the challenges we face at the moment and the level of volatility and unpredictability. And who would have guessed a week ago that it would be that particular region, but you'd have known it was going to be a region probably somewhere in the world. And with our global supply chains, I think it makes it incredibly challenging, whether it's through production factories or sort of mining, etc., or the logistics side of it, where you might not even understand fully where all of your material passed through, and therefore you might take some time to realise you've got an issue.
And maybe that's the issue. I mean, you said you've been in Transport for Wales for 9 months now. I mean, I suppose it's always the question I ask people is, how well do you know your supply chain? And if you're talking about buying fleet, or if you're buying equipment for the transport network or whatever it would be, I mean, often those manufacturing supply chains are quite complicated, aren't they? Would you say you understand your full supply chain?
I think anyone who says they understand their full supply chain has probably misunderstood the question or is just lying, aren't they? I think we no is the very short answer. We are endeavouring to, but it is very difficult, especially like you said, when you get to OEMs and getting visibility beyond that. And then at the moment, as we'll see in the really tragic situation in the Ukraine and the impact there we're seeing on any trade with Russia into the commodities as well, where again it's that understanding can be very challenging, I think. So no, we really struggle. I would say that's maybe just a reflection on me. The last decade or so of my life in procurement roles has been very much a discussion about how do we get to understand better our supply chains, whether it's the material or the logistics side of it, and it's always a real struggle. So we've got a long way to go, although obviously we're working hard on it at the moment.
Yeah, and I suppose while this article was talking about the disruption of freight, but obviously there's an inflationary pressures coming through. They were seeing that in terms of freight costs generally, and they've been sort of spiking for a period of time. This clearly is only going to add to that. But the inflationary pressures generally in supply chains, I don't think we've seen that sort of level of inflation for probably 10 years plus, I think, in terms of what we're starting to see feeding through our supply chains.
No, I agree, and not just cost pressures, but straight availability of certain items as well is becoming a real challenge, and obviously has been over a number of years. It's sort of earlier this year there was a lot more discussion about PCBs and sort of those sorts of components as well, wasn't there, in the automotive supply chain? So I agree. I think there's a massive challenge, and it's very difficult to isolate yourself from those cost pressures. And my personal view is we've lived in probably a relatively benign environment, certainly from a UK perspective, for quite some time. As you just said, we're not necessarily set ourselves up to cope with these pressures, and inevitably, as we all see when we go to the supermarket, it's being passed on to the consumers, isn't it? And I think that's a real challenge for every business on how they can absorb the costs or pass them on to further customers. Obviously, we sit as a client, and so although we are revenue, we do earn revenue through passengers. That obviously has had a massive hit because of the pandemic as well. So I think, like many other organisations, we're finding some real pressure at the moment.
Yeah, I was talking to someone this morning, and they were saying, the general sense is it's crisis after crisis, and where do you get the headroom? Where do you have the space to then be able to sort of sit back and actually really start to do some proper planning? And maybe we'll come onto that a bit later, because I think that's sort of longer term strategic impact is maybe what quite a few organisations at the moment are struggling to get to, aren't they? And to move forward in that direction.
Yes, I completely agree. I think we probably went through again, from a UK perspective, we went through Brexit talking about the need to better understand our supply chains and have much better visibility and much better able to manage it. And no sooner have we gone through that than we probably plunged straight into COVID, where we would all be thinking maybe exactly the same thing, but still haven't really been able to find the time or the tools to do it in a sort of cost-effective way. That allows you to make decisions, because ultimately that's the real challenge, isn't it? Is sometimes in certain areas you're a market taker. It's very difficult to work out what decisions are actually gonna really make a difference.
Yeah, and which are the short-term ones and which are the longer-term ones.
Yes, exactly.
I think I'm sure we'll pick that up in a few minutes as well as we go forward. So let me bring in our second guest. It's Sean McCarthy. So Sean, if you could join us, it'd be great for you to welcome you on into Supply Chain Talk. Sean is I think you wear a number of hats. I think in the brief here, I've got down as the chair of Supply Chain Sustainability School. But I also know you've got a few other roles you play as well, Sean. But maybe you can give a quick intro rather than I can, because I've seen you in a number of guises over the years.
Yeah, good afternoon, Duncan. You certainly have. Yeah, so I guess in short, I'm a director of Action Sustainability. Action Sustainability is a business that I founded in 2006, having had a long history in procurement. And the reason that I founded the business is people were starting to talk about sustainable procurement at the time, but there was no help for anybody out there. So to cut a long story short, I packed in my job and started a business. I also took a role as chair of something called the Commission for a Sustainable London 2012. And this was a sustainability oversight organisation for the London 2012 Olympics. Now, within Action Sustainability, we do four things. So we're consultants in sustainable procurement. We help organisations to procure more sustainably. We run the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and I chair the board of the school. This is a collaborative organisation in the built environment sector. We now have near enough 170 partners, all working together with a common objective to upskill their supply chains. I'm very passionate about the idea of collaboration and working together rather than individually. And the school has its 10th anniversary actually in June this year. We're planning a big bash to celebrate that. We have some software which is all about sustainability performance. Then I'm also a director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company. Through that business, we host a community of practice, a global community of practice around sustainable procurement, ISO 2400.org, supporting the international standard and organizations around the world free of charge who want to procure more sustainably. So sorry if that was a long introduction, but that's basically what I do today.
And I knew that was going to be a long introduction. Sure.
Yeah.
Shutting
me up is the challenge, Duncan.
And I think it's quite nice because I think I've been on panel discussions where you've been the chair, so it's quite nice to be in the seat this time around. But I mean, Sean, just taking the macro view initially and maybe building on what we were just talking about here with Richard. I mean, the disruptions down through supply chains and the ongoing shocks in the supply chains, and it's probably greater than I know I've ever seen, and probably in the same boat in terms of what you've seen as well. I mean, how do you think procurement organisations are coping with this? What are you seeing people doing to try and overcome what is clearly quite a challenging situation we're all facing?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're coping, but only just. And I agree with you, Duncan. In my very long, 30-odd career in procurement, I don't think I've seen anything like this. It's there are disruptions to supply chain all over the place, as we said earlier. I mean, it's been about COVID, it's been about Brexit, the cost pressures such as we've never seen before, shortages of materials, freight costs, going through the roof, labor shortages. We've had this perfect storm of Brexit, COVID, now disastrous war in Ukraine, which are disrupting our supply chains like never before. It's interesting. Through some of the work that I do, I've actually got some funding in the construction industry to help organisations with their procurement. So I've got some free consultancy and free training that I can offer to my partners in the supply chain school. And I struggle to get them to take it up. I've never had to work so hard to sell stuff for free. And it's simply because they're just firefighting. We'd love to think long term, Sean. We'd love you to come and help us with, specific supplier relationship challenges or longer term issues, or maybe train our team to upskill them in procurement. But we haven't got the time. And this is where I think the the disruptions that we see at the moment, sadly, are going to set our profession back. Because, as you said earlier, Duncan, people do not have the headspace to think more strategically, train people, maybe bring new people into the profession, develop their careers. Unfortunately, I don't have any answers to this. It's really a reflection on what's happening today. But we're faced with the situation we're faced. And I think, procurement professionals are nothing if not personally resilient. We are able to deal with crises, but this is a big one.
Yeah. Well, and it's been such a long time, isn't it? It's been that sort of constant sort of, you both talked about that sort of one after another, and who knows what's next. And I think I mean, sat here sort of 3-4 months ago thinking, oh well, there won't be a war between Russia and Ukraine, and you just said earlier, Richard, it's suddenly got to a point where suddenly it's happened, and there's another shock down through the supply chains, another spike on inflation. I mean, oil price going through the roof in a way that none of us really expected to see. And again, just another spike that's come through. So, but I mean, I've just seen a really interesting question from Mark Bowden, actually, in the chat, which actually said, is sustainability one of the first things that organization makes, or one of the first sacrifices that organizations make in order to maintain order or keep output going? And I suppose, back to your point, I think, Sean, when people are really under pressure, and it's all about trying to keep manufacturing flowing, trying to keep the supplies going. Do you drop some of the other nice things you'd like to do? And I'll use that phrase in the wrong way because I know you'll hit me for it about sustainability. But actually, do you focus on just the things that are imperative for supply, and then I'll come back to that later. I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting question.
It is a really interesting question, because if I go back to the global financial crisis of 2008, that was absolutely the case. Sustainability got dropped like a hot potato. And quite frankly, I started my business in 2006, and it very nearly went and bust in 2009 for that very reason. Nowadays, no. Actually, I think what's been happening in the last couple of years has actually forced people to think more about sustainability. There's obviously a bigger emphasis with, the Greta effects and the David Attenborough effects and what have you. I think it's much more mainstream in people's minds now. But I think there is also a realization that I've always said, as you know, Duncan, that if you think sustainable procurement costs more, then you're doing it wrong. But people are starting to think. I was talking to a client this morning, and they were saying, well, we're going to switch all of our diesel supply over to HVO, hydrogenated vegetable oil, because we can fix the price of HVO for 12 months. And now we're not exposed to price volatility in diesel, and people are starting to think about logistics and transport with freight rates going up, and the cost implications of having these long supply chains are starting to hurt. The disruption of supply chains around the world that we've spoken about are starting to hurt. Looking at supply chains closer to home is better for carbon emissions. It's starting to be better for cost. It's better for social value. So if I look at what we've done in the supply chain school, in the COVID year, I think like everybody else, we thought, well, this is going to be disastrous. We're going to have to hunker down and try and survive. We actually doubled the number of people that were attending our training events in that 12 months. And in this current year, we've added another 50%. We were celebrating under 2 years ago now, certainly during COVID, 100 partners in supply chain school. We now have 170. So oddly enough, I don't think sustainability is going on to the back burner, because it's no longer a nice thing to do. It's essential for the survival of the profession. I think procurement professionals are starting to recognize now that, most organizations do most things they do through their supply chains. So therefore, the procurement professional becomes the gatekeeper of new standards of sustainability. So oddly enough, although we're in this crisis situation and everybody's firefighting, I don't see the sustainability agenda going away in the way it did in 2008.
Right. I'd completely echo that. I think, for two reasons, I guess. Firstly, it's undoubtedly much more established as an agenda much more important for businesses, expectations of consumers, etc. So I think that's materially different, isn't it? But secondly, and your point about diesel is a really good illustration of it. Some of the current crises around energy prices, etc., push you into a much more unsustainable environment.
Right.
And so I think it's really usefully highlighted to people that what they'd taken for, or maybe what some had taken for granted and thought they could assume would be there for the foreseeable future. Actually, there's much more risk than they'd really realised. And I think the same is true again, as you mentioned, in terms of long logistic supply chains. Suddenly having something near doesn't feel like such a cost premium anymore, does it? And I think it gives a very different lens when you look at your supply chain with these sorts of things layered on top of it. That were maybe always theoretical risks, but actually hadn't bitten that hard for quite a long time.
And maybe linked to that the business, whichever business you work with now, whether it's in government or whatever, they're asking the same questions, aren't they? Whereas it maybe, Sean, when you talk about when you first started Action Sustainability, you're trying to push an agenda that people are going, really? Whereas actually risk and resilience linked into sustainability, they're sort of wrapping around each other, aren't they? And actually the same questions are being asked in a number of ways, of which the answer often is yes. It is that shorter supply chain. It is that more local supplier base. And by the way, there are good sustainability benefits that come from it, but you've got to change your supplier base. And I think that's the bit that, when times are tough and people are busy, trying to change that supplier base is often quite a challenging thing to do. And maybe the plans are there. We've got to see the evidence of those plans coming through yet.
Yeah, certainly when I started, everybody thought I'd gone mad. But
I remember meeting you when you started as well. I didn't think that at all, sure.
No, you didn't. That's right. Yeah. Absolutely. But it was quite a niche thing at the time. Yeah, I think you're right. There is more demand now, and it's certainly coming down from clients such as Richard. The public sector really is starting to drive this agenda hard now. But interestingly, in the private sector, in the last couple of years, the drive from investors has become massive. And that's what businesses worry about now. They worry about their share price. They worry about the cost of insuring their business. They worry about their cost of borrowing. Big investors like BlackRock are saying, well, if you don't have a credible story on climate change, we're going to vote your board of directors off the board. It's becoming threat now. It's not even like nice anymore. So I think those drivers are forcing people to think, and inevitably then you do start to think about supply chains and how you might do things differently. So yeah, we are in this perfect storm where sustainability is no longer a nice to have, and it is very much a mainstream thing. And as you say, there are the links to issues such as risk and resilience and cost. I think there are problems on the horizon, of course, because as Richard said, moving to more renewable forms of energy seems like a very good idea rather than relying on Russian gas, for instance. But then if I had a quid for everybody that said they're going to change from diesel to HVO, I'd probably be quite a rich man. And I'm sure there isn't enough HVO in the world to satisfy that demand. So, we're going to look at strategic supply chain issues very differently going forward for different types of products, so that the challenges don't go away, they just become different challenges.
I mean, there's a couple of really good questions that are coming. I'm going to come back to one from Paul in a minute. And I want to move on to the main core of the topic here, which was around the role we can play. But I just wanted to sort of touch on, there's a question or a comment in from Ivanson and Jomo. It says, hi all, good topic on how we need to adapt from supply chain post-Russia-Ukraine challenges. I think, Evanson, just before we go in there, that would take us a whole hour, right? And so I don't think that is a topic we can cover off today, but it will be one we'll come back to as we go forward in supply chain talk, because it's going to be clearly how that plays out and how the sanctions play out and how the whole impact of the disruption and the devastation plays out. We'll come back to, but not for today. But there is a good question from Paul on fuel, which I want to come back to. But let's come into this sort of the main core of the discussion we wanted to get to here, which was around this, what role can procurement play? Because I think we can talk broadly about, the sustainability, but if we're talking about increasing sustainability, improving living standards, What sort of proactive initiatives can we make as procurement professionals in this space? I'd be really interested in, maybe Richard, we'll start with you. I mean, in what you're seeing in your role in Transport for Wales, in the sort of what you can do or what you're planning to do. It'd be sort of great to get some of your insights as to the role that procurement can proactively play, the positive role we can play in this space.
Yeah, sure. But before I answer the actual question, one thing I would say is, I'm new to moving into working in the Welsh government, or for an arm's length body of the Welsh government. It's been really interesting that they've passed legislation. So the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, if people aren't familiar with it, is really worth looking at because it's fascinating what they're trying to do about improving the environment, the economy, society, and Welsh culture. And I think there's some really good lessons there for anyone actually, and a really good framework to think about what do you actually mean by sustainability and these sorts of things, and what might you want to achieve. So I would just sort of signpost that to people as well worth a short read. It's a fascinating area. In terms of what we can do from a procurement perspective, and of course we're subject actually to the Future Wellbeing Generations Act, so we are worrying about it a lot. I think about it in three different places mainly, probably. So firstly, I think there's a big part about informing requirements. I think, was it Sean talked about us being the gatekeepers, and I think that's a really important bit of being able to feed back to people who are thinking about what they might want to buy, where the market is and what's going on, and where the innovation might be and where the good practice is. Easier said than done, as with most of these things. Secondly, a really interesting thing we're looking at, certainly in a number of procurements, is how do we structure our procurements better to deliver some of these things that are potentially really quite difficult at the moment. So, just this morning I was talking about one procurement that will include a reasonable amount of energy that will be need to bought because it's about electric vehicles. So, who should bear that risk, and how are you going to best be able to structure things to get the right decisions made? And that includes us looking at taking on more risk ourselves. Because that's the right thing to do, because it will get us the right outcome. And then the third one is the really simple working with your suppliers. And I think we underestimate massively the amount of value we can get if we just collaborate. And the sustainability school, I think, is probably a great example of that. And we use it in TFW, but there's so many different common causes now that actually you can work really well on with suppliers that can make a massive difference. So I would look at those three broad areas as things we're working on quite hard at the moment.
Right. And that sort of, and I'm sure Sean will come out of the collaboration bit, but that collaboration with the suppliers, and particularly, I suppose, local impact. I know within government is also quite a big driver, isn't it? That actually, working with the local suppliers, developing the local supplier base, job creation that comes from that, but also the upskilling that comes from it. I mean, that's I think it's a major push for most governments across the world, and I'm sure Welsh government's no different on that.
No, so the Welsh government is absolutely definitely no different from that. I do think you need to pick the right procurements to try and look more locally on. It's not going to be suitable for everything. There almost never is a one size fits all answer, is there? But really identifying those procurements that you can work locally and structuring things to do that is absolutely key. We do quite a lot of work with some of our suppliers on other things as well, especially around do some work at the moment on ex-offenders. And how can we help them back into the jobs market, or military veterans, and how do we make sure that we're really tapping into a great source of talent there? Because of course these things, business can do this out of self-interest as well. There's definitely a talent shortage. So looking at areas that are a bit untraditional but deliver on these sorts of wider these sorts of sustainability goals, absolutely key for us at the moment.
Yeah, and embedding that in ways of working, embedding it so that it becomes part of the decision making and not questioned. Because I think at the moment you still add some of those weightings in there, but there'll always be those naysayers will go, oh well, if you took that out, then we could get this cheaper. And that tension will be there for a while, I think, won't it? In those sort of decision making.
I think it will be. I go back a bit to what we talked about earlier, that the nature of the issues we're seeing at the moment do seem to actually help the argument, not hinder it. And that's, I guess it's not positive we've got the issues, but it's not unhelpful from the point of delivering better, more sustainable solutions. it's inevitably a debate that has to happen, because there are finite amount of money, generally speaking, for things, aren't there? And so sometimes there has to be trades. I do think there are plenty of things that actually you don't need to trade, where you can get a positive, sustainable solution that didn't actually cost you more. And we've certainly got some good examples of that. So a couple of years ago, so before I joined the organisation, when we were buying furniture for our new offices, they're now almost all of it, 80% I think, was refurbished. So that saves us money, saves an awful lot of carbon, because we didn't buy new. We were able to use some of our own, but a lot of other people's furniture as well. And frankly, when you're in the office, you really wouldn't know. It looks fantastic. And I think there's some actually quite simple things like that talking to people undoubtedly took a bit of time to persuade people that their requirement wasn't for new furniture, and that it wasn't going to look really shabby and sort of be a bit embarrassing, but was a really good answer. But now everybody absolutely sold on it, and it's a great example where you can do some quite simple things and really open people's eyes to what's possible.
Yeah, that's really good. And Sean, let's come to you from that broader picture of what can procurement do. I know there's a lot of things they can do, and Richard's covered a number of aspects there. But from your perspective, what do you think are the real focal points that currently procurement should be doing to really drive this agenda forward?
Yeah, I'm a great fan of the Future Generations Act and what's going on in Wales globally. I think it's really impressive that the Welsh Government has actually set this agenda out in such a positive way. There are sometimes unintended consequences, so let's deal with a couple of the potential negatives first and then move on to the positives. One could be an economic one. If you focus too much on a small local supply chain in a relatively small place like Wales, the suppliers can become complacent. So I think there is a need to inject that competition and to keep the competition going. And as Richard said, I think, and you've also said, Duncan, that there is a need to change this mindset from the sort of old school, buyer-supplier relationship, master-slave relationship, to a more collaborative way of working and engaging with suppliers in ways that can drive costs down for the buyer, but also drive profits up for the supplier. So I think there's still some way to go in the procurement profession in thinking those things through. But if we can, then we can achieve great success. Yeah, I guess if I look at what my client base and my partners in supply chain school are thinking about and worrying about right now, it's basically two things: it's carbon and it's social value.
Right.
Those are the two really, really hot topics at the moment. Yeah, there's loads of other stuff. There's biodiversity, there's modern slavery, there's circular economy. There's all of those things, but really, it's boiling down to those two things. Carbon, because I think the world has woken up to the idea that we really do have a climate crisis and we need to do something about it. So we're seeing organizations all over the place setting their net zero policies, some of them quite realistic, some completely fictitious. But nonetheless, it is driving everybody to think about really, really how do we get carbon out of the equation. And even working as I do with the cement industry, for instance, 70% of the carbon emissions from making cement are not in energy, they're in the actual chemical process itself. So the only solution really is carbon capture and storage. And we're possibly decades away from that.
Right.
So I think there needs to be, a reality check on some of these things to understand that some of these solutions are actually very complex, extremely costly, all sorts of implications related to planning and land use and those sorts of things that we need to think about. But there are also some very simple solutions and things that we can do to reduce carbon. So as Richard said, things like electric vehicles, things like moving to more renewable sources of energy are relatively short-term solutions that we can deal with. On the social value side, very much driven by public sector, very much driven by PPN 06, the procurement policy notice that came into effect in January 21. And that's demanding a minimum of 10% weighting criteria for public procurement on social value. But actually, a lot of public procurers are adding significant additional percentages. Some of my clients are looking at 30, 40% weighting factor on social value. That makes a difference between winning and losing a job. And some really good things that Richard has mentioned, employment of ex-offenders, employment of military veterans, disabled people, local people in underprivileged communities. Those sorts of things really make a difference. I mean, if you can really work with your suppliers to bring people, for instance, out of intergenerational dependence on benefit, you get one person in the family off benefit and into a proper job, you make a difference to that entire family. And that means then that that person is coming off benefit and into actually providing a contribution to society. If you weigh that up against, again, as Richard said, the inevitable labour shortages that we have all over the place, it kind of starts to make sense to do that now. So I think it's not only a really heavy drive through public procurement, but a realization then that actually social value can add value to your business and save you some money.
And I think that's great summary there, Sean. But one of the points you raised, I think, and I was just reading through a couple of questions that came in, but one that's coming from Shagufta Ahmed, I think, which talks about measuring sustainability. What are the parameters for it? I'm not going to read out the whole question, but basically, it is that point of you talk about sort of carbon, and you're talking about sort of the impact that's there. But actually, I think the question here is, how do you measure it? And one of the things we wanted to come to was, what is the monitoring process? What's the best way of measuring impact of sustainability? And maybe linked to that is also the same point you made about social value, because I think when I first started talking to organizations about what they were doing on social value, they were really just rehashing and telling you what they were doing anyway. We're employing some apprenticeships, so therefore we'll put that in our sort of tick box on social value, whereas you described a very different, more proactive approach there to really impact society through the spend that you make. But you need to be able to measure. Maybe the measures need to drive performance. They need to drive a different way of operating. I'd be interested in both your views. How do you baseline, but then how do you really put those measures in place to really monitor progress and real impact that you're having?
Would you like to start, Richard?
Yeah, I thought it was an easy one for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
how long have you got?
Well, so I would say this is a question that we continue to grapple with, undoubtedly. And you see some solutions that develop incredibly complex kind of matrices of how to measure it. And my personal view is that actually the energy and effort just in understanding that makes it almost not worthless is probably wildly unfair, but it certainly diminishes. And I'm constantly challenging my teams to how do we take this hugely complex topic that in some respects is very simple to measure. Like you said, will just tell us how many apprentices. That's quite tangible, isn't it? But actually then you need to understand, was that an improvement or not? And there are there's some sectors where actually there are already a lot of apprentices and probably have been for quite some time, so you might be patting yourself on the back feeling like you've generated some great amount of worth there, but all you've actually done is measured what already existed anyway. And again, that comes a bit into understanding your market, doesn't it? So do you have enough intelligence to ask the right questions or set your baselines in the right area? We undoubtedly still really grappling with exactly how do we do it, and especially when you get onto things that are maybe less obviously directly measured, like numbers of apprenticeships. I think it can be really quite hard. I do think we see a lot of, as I touched on earlier, we see a lot of people willing to do things regardless of how they're measured, almost because they now appreciate it's the right thing to do. And I'm maybe slightly perversely, I've always been a big fan of sort of almost putting the contract to one side sometimes, regardless of what it obliged us all to do, and let's have a discussion about what we can practically really do, because it is now such a topic. But I wish I could point you to the link that showed you exactly the right way to measure social value, etc. And if it does exist, I haven't yet found it myself.
Yeah, but I think even that example you gave a bit earlier about the office furniture, I mean, that's a great example, isn't it? You've recycled, but actually to really then measure the true impact of that, you can do huge calculations, or you can just go, it was the right thing to do.
I think we you can relatively simply measure the cost because we know what we thought it was going to cost us to buy furniture, etc.
Yeah.
Actually, we have done an attempt to work out how many tons of CO2, etc. And I'm now regretting that I didn't scribble that down so it's at the front of my head. But I can find it for you if I have a little bit of time. So we did try to estimate how many tons of CO2, etc. it would have saved because we didn't have to have it manufactured, etc. But I agree, it's some of these things are going to be a bit imprecise, aren't they?
Yeah.
I think they can be very useful in underlining that it was the right thing to do and providing something that feels tangible. You put a number on anything and it feels tangible to people, doesn't it? Which can be quite positive. But I think you've got to keep a mild level of skepticism as well on some of these things, haven't you? And that's what makes it very difficult when we think about a public sector approach that wants to have structured evaluation criteria that people can evidence, and then KPIs ideally in a contract that fit with whatever the bid said, so that you are making sure you measure what people promise they go and do. And that's where we definitely see some of our challenges.
So Richard's answered, Sean. Has he covered everything you were going to say?
A couple of things. Of course you must measure, and I'm slightly biased because I can sell you a lovely piece of software that will help you to do that. But actually, what I would advise clients quite frequently is you don't need our software yet, because you haven't sorted out your goals. You don't know what you're shooting for. You haven't got things in your contracts. You haven't, there is so much that you need to go through strategically before you get to measuring things. And then, of course, you do need to measure, but you do need to understand what you want your suppliers to do before you start measuring them. And people do kind of make the mistake of diving straight to the KPIs when actually you haven't sorted out what you want to do. In social value, oh my God, there is so much out there now and so many unintended consequences. I was looking at one the other day, literally, I think it was like yesterday, for a client. They wanted to measure, they wanted to mitigate the risk of modern slavery. So the measure that they have chosen for their suppliers was the pounds spent on training their staff in avoiding modern slavery. I'm like, well, I run the supply chain school. You can get probably the best modern slavery training available, certainly anywhere in the UK, possibly anywhere in the world. You can get it for free. So you would score 0 on that KPI for the amount of money that you spent on training. I mean, on what planet does somebody think that's a sensible KPI? On apprenticeships, I know of a contractor that I won't name, that was building some buildings in a London borough that I won't name either, because part of their planning consent was you must have 6 apprentices on this project. So they went out and they hired 6 apprentices. The project only lasted 9 months. So they sacked the apprentices when they finished the project. So they ticked the box. As Richard said, there is a temptation to say, yeah, I've ticked the. So they ticked the box to say 6 apprentices. Those 6 people joined the construction industry in good faith, expecting a career, and they got sacked at the end of 9 months. They did not finish their apprenticeship, and I'm sure they will never come back to this industry again. And then we wonder why we have labour shortages. But unfortunately, that local authority, through their planning demand, has created that unintended consequence. And the contractor then also being slightly unscrupulous hasn't helped. But also at the bottom of that, there were 6 people whose careers didn't take the direction that they wanted them to take. So you do need to think really carefully, but my advice would be think about what you want to achieve first, and think about your KPIs last. Then really think about it properly in terms of what you need to do. Then come and buy my software. But that's the last thing you need to do.
Before we plug anything else.
Sorry, shameless advert, but I'll shut up now. Okay, you can switch me off now if you like.
I thought the free training was great. I think everything else was great. You're doing really well up to that point.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
but I do think your point's really well made about the resources that are available now to help. I think you both touched on that. The guidance that's out there, the support that's out there. There is a lot that's there. Maybe people don't have all the answers yet. But I think, Richard, your point's well made. Maybe you just got to get started on some of this and do the stuff you can do, and then some of the other things will come through behind it.
I have a number of discussions internally with people about, we end up in extended debates about should you have 20% or 30% weighted on it, et cetera, et cetera. And you sort of say, well, do you know what? let's just do something,
Yeah.
and then we can refine it over time. These aren't permanent solutions for some of these things we put in place. Let's just do something and learn and get into that slightly more iterative process, rather than thinking that we have to have our perfect solution for all of our procurements. Now we can actually keep growing into it, and take our learning with us.
Yeah, and hold your suppliers to account for actually doing it, because at the end of the day, percentage and weighting factors don't mean very much if the supplier promises the moon on a stick and then doesn't deliver.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's the key thing, isn't it? Is don't pick things that actually will either become very difficult to measure, that were easy to measure in a bid, but very difficult to then measure in the real world. I think there's a key point there. But also, secondly, that aren't going to set you up for some impossible decisions later when someone comes back and says, well, I can do that for you, or I can deliver the outcome that you really wanted here, and sort of force you into these sorts of dilemmas. So I think there's a lot of thinking that I completely agree with Sean about what was it you were trying to achieve, and be really focused on that, and then make sure everything else lines up behind that. Because if it was what you're trying to achieve, you shouldn't end up with those sort of on that horns of that dilemma, because it was what you were trying to achieve.
I've got one question, a slightly different topic, or coming back to maybe one of the topics we touched on a bit earlier, from Paul O'Neill. So this is really coming back to, I suppose, the tension between supply and cost and sustainability. He says, with carbon prices per tonne set to be considerably lowered due to the increased fuel costs, do you think this will change sustainability agendas and make fuel energy cost a driver ahead of sustainability? And maybe this comes back to a topic we did touch on a bit earlier, but I did notice that Paul had asked the question, so I wanted to come back to it. So just that again, and Richard, I know when we were talking yesterday, prep for this, you were talking about electric buses as a good example. Are things like this going to fundamentally change some decision making that people have about energy costs, fuel costs, but then linked into the sustainability agenda? Can you really build the two in together?
Yeah, I think the short answer is we have to find a way to do that, don't we? I don't think they can exist in two different worlds. I do think the issue that's now been highlighted around energy costs is not going to go away, is it? Even if the costs come down a bit, I think people will be suspicious for at least a few years now. What we definitely struggle with is how do you incentivize a market that maybe won't otherwise do things? So electric vehicles is a good example, where there's certainly there are certain areas where it's probably cheaper still to run diesel. So we're looking at how can we structure it so that in certain areas we're buying the electric vehicles and that'll be provided to someone to operate, rather than expecting them to build a business case that frankly doesn't really exist for them. So that is about us investing, though, in a principle that we want electric vehicles, not sort of leaving the market to deliver it. So I think there are some of those things we can do. My perspective is that energy prices at the moment are so high, it's forcing a lot of people to look at how can they use less energy and how can they move away from fossil fuels to other sources that are much more sustainable. That's certainly how it's impacting us at the moment.
Right. So you actually see those two agendas going hand in hand in a way.
I do at the moment. I think things will, it's probably a more difficult dilemma if energy prices start to reduce hugely, and then people are left with much cheaper options using fossil fuels. But right now, those two things certainly align. It looks logical to move away from fossil fuels at the moment, doesn't it? Just from a cost perspective.
Yeah. What's your thoughts, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, predicting energy prices is if I could do that, I wouldn't be sitting on this talk today. But I think it's it seems sadly the war is pushing things only in one direction. I mean, if Russia is going to be a pariah state for a generation, which I think is very likely, people are going to move away from reliance on oil and gas from Russia. That's only going to drive prices in one direction, and that's going to be up. So I think the exceptionally high prices that we're seeing right now are likely to continue for the foreseeable future, and that does play well into the hands of the sustainability agenda and the drive for renewables. I think also, governments and organisations are getting serious about net zero. I do get a bit annoyed the expression net zero, because everybody's saying it now and nobody's really doing it. But I think, the corporate and the government sense of direction is there. So I agree with Richard. I think there will continue to be a cost incentive, but also I think there's a moral imperative as well, and a genuine reaction to what's happening around climate change. We can see it now. We can understand it. It's a shame, we didn't believe some of the people that were advocating these issues 30 or 40 years ago, but we are where we are. So I think the drive towards renewables now is inevitable.
Yeah,
I'd agree.
So that's great, and we're out of time, guys. I mean, Sean, Richard, I really do appreciate the comments and the thoughts you've given here, and it's clearly it's great to hear the examples of what organisations are doing. But I think it's also this sort of message coming through to procurement and supply chain people is you can make a huge difference here. Whether it's on sustainability, whether it's in the area of social value and the impact you can make, there's a lot you can do. It's a case of making that right call and the right decisions and aligning yourself with your organisations to drive it forward. But really do appreciate your time and the input today. And also thanks to people who sort of added comments in the chat and the questions. There's some really good questions that came in, which I think took us in some really good directions. And probably the one that I've got to give this mug to somebody. So I think it's probably Shagufta Ahmad who asked the question about measuring, because that's probably the one that did cause the most discussion, but actually is the one that's probably the hardest one to do. So there's a mug on its way to you, for
no expense spared with the prizes then.
I'm not trying to sell any software or anything, Sean. I mean, I'm just giving away free mugs here. So that's the only thing I can do.
Other software solutions are available. It's just not as good as mine.
But anyway, I mean, thanks both Richard and Sean. There's been brilliant discussion today. Really appreciate it, and thanks for everyone else who joined us. Next week's Supply Chain Talk is going to change topic again. We're going to talk a lot more about what it takes to become a good supply chain leader. I think we've got 3 great guests who's going to join us there and talk about the skills, the capabilities to really sort of lead the supply chain in these turbulent times. So that should be a really good discussion next week. So hopefully you can join us for that. But in the short term, Richard, Sean, thanks very much for your time, and thanks everyone for watching Supply Chain Talk today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.